Food insecurity. It is a problem in communities across our nation. But what constitutes food insecurity? What's driving it? And more importantly, what approach gives us the best chance of arriving at a solution? Jeremy Everett is the executive director of the Baylor Collaborative on Hunger and Poverty and the author of the new book, I Was Hungry. He joins us tonight to break down those questions and so much more. That's all coming up right here, right now. I'm Sam Chen, and this is Face the Issues. Good evening and welcome to Face the Issues. I'm Sam Chen. Food insecurity is a problem that virtually every community across our nation faces. But what specifically do we mean by food insecurity? What drives that problem? And how do we come to a solution about it? I'm pleased tonight to be joined by Jeremy Everett, who's the executive director of the Baylor Collaborative on Hunger and Poverty. Jeremy, welcome to the program. It's good to see you, and I hope you and your family are doing well.
Thanks, Sam. It's great to be with you tonight, and our family is doing well. I think, like most families, they're getting a little bit stir crazy and anxious to know what the plan is for school this fall.
Oh, I hear that. I definitely hear that. Jeremy, before we even get started, just as by way of introduction, you're the founder of the Baylor Collaborative on Hunger and Poverty, previously known as the Texas Hunger Initiative, or THI. You serve on the National Commission of Hunger. You're a fellow with the Strauss Center of International Security at the LBJ School at the University of Texas. You're a senior fellow with the World Hunger Relief, and you're the author of I Was Hungry, Cultivating Common Ground to End an American Crisis. You've committed your life to this work on finding a solution to food insecurity. And I just want to start at the 30,000 foot level at the basics. When we say food insecurity, what are we talking about?
Yeah, food insecurity is USDA's technical definition for hunger. Essentially, it's how they measure hunger in the U.S. And so food insecurity, the definition is not having enough food to live an active, healthy lifestyle. And so we want to have a good idea as a nation of how many people experience food insecurity, because that gives us a good indication of where the gaps are in some of our broken social systems. Now, the term very low food security really implies hunger. That means that people are regularly missing meals and having to alter food consumption because they don't make enough money to be able to afford food.
And speaking of, you just brought up the idea of making enough money. A lot of times food insecurity, poverty, homelessness are all kind of grouped into one. Now, in other interviews, you've made a distinction between, for example, food insecurity and homelessness. What's that distinction, and why is that important to our understanding of the problem?
Well, I think if we're actually going to develop solutions to addressing the problem, whether that be in the U.S. or in a global environment, you really have to understand the problem. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, we have a tendency in our nation to blame the poor for their plight. That argument really goes all the way back to the Hebrew people being enslaved by Pharaoh, and Pharaoh calling them lazy and forcing them to make their own bricks to use to ultimately build his empire. And so this rhetoric, when we misidentify the problem, then our solutions are always going to be wrong, right? Our solutions can never be right if we're trying to solve the wrong problem. And so one thing that is important is to identify, when you're looking at the entire scope of poverty, is to identify who is experiencing poverty for what subset of reasons, and then what do we need to be able to do to help mitigate those particular reasons so that they can move to economic security and food security. And so if somebody's experiencing homelessness, well, they have a different subset of reasons for largely why they're experiencing food insecurity than maybe the general population who is underemployed, working but only making a minimum wage paying job, and thus unable to pay for all of their needs and expenses.
You mentioned being underemployed, and I think that's another aspect of this conversation that gets missed a lot. The idea that people who experience food insecurity are not necessarily people who have no work or no money, but the food insecurity could be the result of not making enough money or choosing between medical bills and having 3 meals a day. What are the statistics that we're looking at when we talk about the population that is food insecure?
Well, prior to the pandemic, we had 40 million Americans that were considered food insecure, and but what we know is that that number is increased dramatically. There was a New York Times article this week quoting one of our researchers who works with the Urban Institute, Elaine Waxman, who are indicating that 1 in 6 Americans are experiencing some level of food insecurity as a result of the pandemic. But you're right. Every family is forced to make trade-offs who finds themselves in a household that may be experiencing some level of hunger. They're forced to decide every month, do they pay for rent? Do they pay the car payment? Do they pay for groceries or medical expenses or childcare expenses? They don't make enough money to be able to pay for everything. And so every month they have to decide, what are they going to trade off? If you don't pay rent, you get kicked out of your home. If you don't pay your car payment, your car's repossessed. So typically, families make food the one issue that they either try to stretch, so maybe parents will choose not to eat in the latter part of a pay cycle so that their kids can eat, or they try to eat less so that they can, make their food budget stretch to the end of the month. But they're all forced to make trade-offs because they don't make enough money to be able to pay for all those expenses.
And Jeremy, you mentioned that it's gotten worse under the COVID-19 pandemic. And with that, what you just talked about with the idea of being forced to make trade-offs, the number of people that are food insecure growing during the pandemic, is this largely driven by the layoffs and more people not having enough money, or is this driven by like food pantries shuttering or people not contributing that used to perhaps contribute on a regular basis? Like what's been the driving factor, or is it many factors that are driving the increase?
Yeah, I would say it's both. I mean, certainly from an economic standpoint, when people lose their jobs, oftentimes people don't have a savings account to be able to draw from, at least for very long, to be able to provide sustained economic security for their family. So in a normal low-income household, there's a pretty considerable amount of economic volatility, meaning that if you are if you're working at a fast food restaurant on a monthly basis, each week when you go in, you learn what your shifts are going to be for the week. So one week you might get 15 hours, the next week you might get 30 hours. Your hours are not going to be set on a monthly basis or an annual basis, and so families are forced to make adjustments on a weekly basis to determine how much food they're going to be able to afford because they don't know how many hours they're going to possibly get. In addition to that, I mean, you think about underemployment, you think about the average, if you're making a low wage income or minimum wage at $7.25 an hour, even if you're able to put together 40 hours of work during a month or a week, you're only making about $13,000 a year. That's barely enough to be able to pay for rent, much less any other expenses. So you combine traditional low-wage work with increased volatility in terms of work availability due to the pandemic. Some people, being furloughed or being laid off in a permanent capacity or for months on end, and certainly that's led to skyrocketing rates of food insecurity and hunger in the U.S. In addition to that, as you pointed out, we've had a whole host of supply chain logistical issues. We've all been to the grocery store since this pandemic hit and seen barren shelves, and it looks like the end of the world. And so we know that supply chain disruption has really affected the availability of food for our food banks and food pantries. Also, schools closing. That's a main source of food for low-income children around the U.S. And so if schools don't have an availability to be able to get the food to the children where they are when they're not in school, then we also know that that's increasing rates of food insecurity and hunger in the U.S.
Jeremy, you said before that nearly 50% of our school children are on some form of reduced or free lunch program. How concerned are you between the conversation now on returning to school and so many schools going virtual and whether that lunch program will be there, between that and then, to your point, just the way the pandemic has cleaned out shelves and even just the charity organizations are struggling themselves, let alone to help those that they serve? How concerned are you that this pattern continues, and how long do you think before it resets and we're back to at least some level of normalcy in making up the lost ground?
That's a great question. When we think about issues of equity, different school districts have different capabilities to be able to deal with uncertain times. One of our sons goes to a school district that every student that enrolls gets an iPad. So they already had set up and incorporated technology into the rhythm of the school day even before the pandemic happened. One of our other sons goes to an urban inner city school district where they certainly don't have iPads. Some of the school districts that we've worked with in the past oftentimes can only afford a class set of textbooks, much less technology for their students. So in Texas alone, we have over 60% of our kids are on the free introduced lunch program that are in our public school system. So when we think about, so my wife and I right now have been faced with the decision: do we send our kids back to school, knowing that the pandemic is really peaking in places like Texas, or do we choose an online route? Many schools are saying that you either have to come in person or you can enroll your child to do online learning. We certainly know that our kids will do better in person. There's no debate about that whatsoever. But we, as a family, have the luxury to be able to make that decision based upon our child's health and well-being, where many Americans who are in low-income households don't have that choice at all. Either their schools are unable to provide some kind of an online option because they simply can't afford it, or families who don't really have an option to be able to leave their children at home because they don't have Wi-Fi at home, they don't have any kind of internet capability at home, and they work hourly jobs, so it's not like they're going to be able to stay home with their kids and help provide any kind of extra tutorials for their children. So they don't really have an option. So while sometimes my wife and I lament that this is a very difficult decision for us, and our friends are lamenting as well that this is just a hard decision to make, many Americans don't even have that decision at all to make. The decision's made for them simply because of their socioeconomic level. And to me, that really speaks to some larger inequities that have been present for a long time, but are certainly manifesting themselves in some unique ways and challenges during this pandemic.
Yeah, I think that's really, really good insight that a lot of families who don't deal with the problem themselves might not realize. Jeremy, thank you for that breakdown. When we come back, I want to start talking about solutions. You've proposed a number of very innovative solutions, and I want to get into those, so don't go away. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Face the Issues. I'm here with Jeremy Everett from the Baylor Collaborative on Hunger and Poverty. Jeremy, welcome back. Thank you again for the work you do, of course, but the way you broke down a lot of these issues and these conversation items earlier. I want to ask you about solutions and your work, first through the Texas Hunger Initiative and now through the Baylor Collaborative, as you've very innovatively merged both a private and public sector. You have merged Republicans and Democrats, liberals and conservatives. You've merged faith-based organizations and completely secular, non-religious people. And you have, it really is a collaborative approach to the work that you do. Could you explain a little bit about how you approach this issue and why you approach it the way you do?
Well, it's a great question. And, I think most of the time, when we're trying to get all these different groups and sectors to be able to partner, it seems like we're just trying to torture ourselves. And so try to make it as complicated as possible. The reality is that hunger and poverty are too big for any one organization or any one sector to address by themselves. These are systemic issues, some of which that have been around since the history of humanity. And so we're not going to volunteer our way out of it. This is something where we need our best leaders in our country, our brightest researchers and thinkers, and our most committed people in local communities and public servants to really commit their lives to this particular cause, because it's something that is solvable. Now, we produce enough food for everyone to have 3 healthy meals a day, 7 days a week, no matter where they live in our nation. We produce that much for a global, to address the global issue of food insecurity and hunger. But we've got some significant challenges, and those significant challenges aren't going to be fixed by myself or just by our university, but they're going to be fixed by us building this collaborative effort so that we can really benefit from what each other are good at and adept at doing. So when you think about the logistical challenges of getting food to families who are in low-income households. Now, low-income households are often transient, so families are moving from one house to another, sometimes multiple times in a year. But typically, low-income neighborhoods and low-income communities aren't transient. Many of them have been low-income for, decades, if not a century. And so we know where the families are, and we really need the corporate sector, who are incredibly gifted with logistics, to help us figure out how we get food to families at the right time, the right food, and the right amount, so that families are able to thrive. But then we also need the nonprofit sector, people who are committed to living and loving and learning from individuals on a local level, and who are committed to the collective health and well-being of a community. And we need the government sector. No one puts more resources into addressing hunger and poverty than the federal government, and so we can't do it without them. But all really kind of, when I think about it from a faith perspective, we think about faith animating our worldview or breathing life into everything that we do. And certainly we know that all this needs to be undergirded by that faith, so not only being committed to God, but being committed to loving our neighbors ourselves.
Yeah. And Jeremy, one of the things, and you mentioned this as you were talking just now about different corporations and the federal government being involved. One of the things that you've emphasized is that this is really not a local issue, but a national and global issue. And I always like to say that we have issues that are local and global, that affects every community around the world. Why is it so many food pantries take a very local approach to it. Why, for you, is it so important that this is a global or at least a national approach to solving the problem?
Well, I spent 20 years living and working in low-income neighborhoods, and much of that was trying to develop community-based interventions. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that I finally realized is that, hunger and poverty largely look the same whether you're in Anacostia in Washington, D.C., or you're in downtown Philadelphia, or the west side of San Antonio, or West Dallas. But oftentimes, if we're addressing this purely as a local issue, then we're missing the fact that it is systemic in nature. And so really, we do need to address it on a local, state, and federal level, and even a global level simultaneously. I joke with our team, I said, well, when you're trying to address these big systemic issues purely as a local issue, it's like trying to address internal bleeding with a topical cream. And it doesn't matter how much cream you put on your body, you're not going to stop the bleeding. You really have to work in a systemic capacity. Now, that doesn't mean that any one intervention, that doesn't mean that people who work in advocacy in Washington are more important than the folks working in a food pantry in a local community. It's just that we have to recognize that we're collectively interdependent on each other to be able to be effective and ultimately end hunger in our lifetime.
And Jeremy, I want to ask you about the role of the federal government or any state government in all this. I used to work as a staffer in both houses of Congress, and this is always part of the debate, which is everyone needs funding, and we have to figure out how to allocate it. And everybody wants every project funded, and at some point we say, okay, well, where are we going to move the funding from and to? Where do you see the role of the federal government coming in place? Is it just in a role of funding, or is there another approach the government should take in addition to funding that you see can be beneficial toward resolving the food insecurity problem?
Well, funding is definitely a big part of it, and making sure that our federal nutrition programs are robust and doing the best that they possibly can from an efficiency and an effectiveness standpoint. But another important role that Congress plays, as does USDA, is that they really can help vet and validate programs that are working and that have scalable potential. So most programs, before they became a national program, were tested and vetted, oftentimes for years, sometimes for decades, in smaller pilot projects around the U.S. And it's through those pilot projects and the evaluation that goes alongside it, where you have, great academics who are really researching and evaluating the effectiveness of those particular programs. That's how Congress can then ultimately make informed decisions about how to invest taxpayer money. Also think that taxpayers, or those of us, all of us, need to give voice to the things that are important to us. If we know, for example, that the SNAP program has tremendous economic impact, both for the individual family who utilizes it, but also for the community, then that may be a program that we determine, hey, this is a program that is a strong program, it's well run, it's robust, let's invest more into it. And I'll give an example specifically with SNAP, is that for every dollar that comes into a family's food budget through that program, they immediately reinvest it in the local economy. I joke with our economists that this is trickle up economics rather than trickle down. And so you're investing in the most low income people in your community, who immediately reinvest that in the local grocery store. Mm-hmm. And what grocery chains have told us is that program accounts for one of every 10 jobs that they have in their store. So not only are you providing food for a family that desperately needs it, you're also providing jobs and economic impact. For every dollar, $1.79 comes into a community through economic stimulus and impact through that particular program, which has tremendous effects both for our farmers, but also our grocers and the kids who are oftentimes our cashiers in our grocery stores. It creates economic opportunity for everybody. So those are the kinds of things, when we're looking at the government choosing to intervene, those are the things that you want. That's where you want government to step up and intervene, in evidence-based, informed decisions that can really get the multiplier effect when they're utilized.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that response, and again, I appreciate the nuance that you talk with on all of these issues. So, Jeremy, thank you for being with us. Don't go away. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Face the Issues. Jeremy, thank you again for your time, and especially for the work that you do. We're certainly very, very appreciative of you spent your career dedicated to this, and we're very grateful for that. Closing out, I want to talk a little bit about your book. It's a new book. It's called I Was Hungry, Cultivating Common Ground to End an American Crisis. Let me start asking briefly, what's the book about and what drove you to write this?
Yeah, well, part of it is based upon the experiences that I had by living in low-income communities for 2 decades. What we saw both after hours, we had a good friend and a neighbor who was a committed volunteer to community, who had 8 children who would oftentimes come down and play with our kids. And while we were living next door to her, she passed away due to an ear infection. She had dealt with a myriad of issues. Her family was underemployed. Her husband was the only person on our block that had gainful employment with one employer. Everybody else was piecing together jobs, but their family was regularly experiencing food insecurity. Their power might get cut off. They certainly didn't have health insurance, which is why she ultimately died of an ear infection that was a very preventable, very treatable issue. Well, those kinds of experiences, I think help paint a picture. And another one that I had when I was working in communities was responding to Hurricane Katrina. We really saw how bad of a disaster that was as a nation. And not only was the disaster bad, but our response was uncoordinated and really was a disaster in and of itself. And it was through working with and partnering with Homeland Security and working in medical special needs shelters to address different types of major issues that were happening around our country in the early 2000s that really caused a light bulb to come on. And I realized at that point, it really requires all sectors to respond not only to these big disasters. Not only do you need churches and nonprofits and local, state, and federal government to all be speaking the same language and on the same wavelength, but we really need this for sustained work in addressing hunger and poverty. Oftentimes, the numbers in our communities are so big that they're overwhelming, and the lines are so long at our food pantries that we don't think about who else in our community is dealing with the same kind of thing. And then how can we ultimately build a collaborative effort to identify where are gaps of service in the community, where are these systemic issues plaguing our community year in, year out, and then working together to address those particular problems. And so all that was probably the impetus for the book. And then certainly the title comes from Matthew 25, where Jesus says, "I was hungry and you gave me food." And that was part of the criterion to be able to experience the kingdom of God in the future.
Yeah. And Jeremy, real quick, for our viewers who want to buy your book, where can they get it?
They can get it on Amazon or any local bookstore. So you can just look up "I Was Hungry" on Amazon and it'll be right there.
That's great. The book, again, is called "I Was Hungry, Cultivating Common Ground to End an American Crisis." Jeremy, thank you for what you do. Thank you for your time today. We certainly appreciate it and love to have you back for a future episode.
Thank you, Sam, and thank you for all that you're doing.
Absolutely. That is all the time we have tonight. My thanks to Jeremy Everett for joining us and for dissecting really a national issue that impacts all of our communities. My name is Sam Chen. On behalf of all of us here at Face the Issues, thank you and good night.